and maybe how to apply it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about this photo that you used as the sample here, just so to make
Yes.
sure I've got this right. So the the waterfall in the foreground, that's just a little bit to the right of that left rule of third, where those lines are intersecting on the bottom left.
Yes.
So that V-shaped waterfall, the center of that is just a little bit to the right and below, right?
Yes.
So if I wanted to be dead on the rule of third, I could have that V like right where those lines are crossing.
Yes, you could. Now, this will determine, or depending on how your subject is and how you compose it. So if I was to do that, I would have to shift my composition over to the right a little bit.
Yeah.
And there may be something distracting there that I don't
Gotcha.
want to include. Right?
Gotcha. So you can be close, and you don't have to be right on that intersect.
Exactly.
Okay.
So this is where it's a guideline. It's not a hard and fast rule where you got to put, your main subject on each one of those points. It's you use that area.
Yeah. Okay.
And with this photograph, that's exactly what it was. Is that, I mean, I don't bring a grid out with me when I shoot. I've been doing it for long enough that I see that way.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And this is what you do. And even in Lightroom, when you go into the cropping function, it can bring up a rule of thirds grid, and you can use that as an exercise on your computer when you come home if you haven't maybe necessarily got it right in that. You can crop it and just kind of play around with it and that type of thing. One of the other things within this photograph is diagonal lines really help the flow of the photograph, and you'll notice the cascade goes off from the right to the left in a diagonal. Mm-hmm. And what that does is create flow from one side of the photograph to the other, but not just from left to right, but also it goes on a diagonal. So it takes you up and then up into the stream, which runs back up. And this way, you want your eyes to flow throughout the scene and kind of have a starting point and a finishing point initially. And then your eyes settle and you start to look around a bit. Now, one thing I will show with this photograph is, while we're on this one right now, is this photograph is intentionally not finished at this stage. So there's a couple elements that I wanted to point out that could be distracting or throw the image off balance. Mm-hmm. That is, in the left side, in the center, you can see a stick coming out into the water. Mm. Okay, and then what I find is that's kind of that'll catch your eye, and it'll make you stop there. For me, that is a distracting element within the photograph, so I would eliminate that. Now, what I actually did is I walk up and I'll just pick it up and take it out. If I can't, then I can clone it out. And this was just a loose stick, so it wasn't part of a tree beside it or anything like that. The other element, go ahead.
I was saying, considering the detail, then they're a lot easier to walk over and throw it out than clone it out.
Yes, for sure, and that's exactly what I did. So, but depending there, and I use this as an example because you may not always be able to do that. It may be live. So this is just an example. So you don't want to go up and break a branch, things like that. I mean, we're out in nature to enjoy it, and I kind of have this thing about, we don't want to destroy it while we're there. One of the other distracting elements within this photograph is on the top right-hand side. You'll see an area where the earth has fallen out, and it's dark compared to the rest of the photograph. So I see that as something where it kind of catches your eye. It's dark. It's not. It doesn't flow with the rest of the photograph. So it draws your eye over to that side. So what I'll do now, and put another one up here, and you guys may even have that up. But I'll just to get the exact photograph, you can click on the link in the chat window. So this is what would be considered at another stage of finishing. Does everybody have that next one up?
Yes.
So if you can see both of those, if you have them open in different windows, you can kind of go back and forth between them and see the difference in, how removing the stick on the one side kind of helps take that distraction out of there. And then what I've done in the top right-hand corner where the dark earth was, is I've just taken some foliage from another part of the photograph and put it in there just to bring it back into balance. So now if you go back and forth between the photographs, you can see that this photograph just has a much cleaner, less distracting look to it. Anybody have anything they want to bring up about that, or points they want to make, questions?
I was wondering, Roy, if you used a filter on this image to prevent the highlights being blown out.
No,
that flow.
No. On this one, the only thing I used was a polarizer.
Oh.
So that would be just to reduce reflections, and that will help bring any of the highlights down a little bit. But for the most part, I used exposure to keep the highlights under control. And this is a situation where I would say this is in a gorge, so it's very soft, diffuse light, but the water will attract the light, or because it's a waterfall, it becomes much lighter than the other water. So by exposing for the highlights in the water and not having them blown out, that helps with the exposure. So the background, I had to bring the background up a little bit, but I don't have to worry about my water being exposed, overexposed. So what you'll get is you get hot spots in your water where there's no detail. It's just pure white.
Yeah.
So you don't really want that.
Well, what about the how to get that water like that? I thought you use a gray filter for that, or ND filter, however you call it.
The only thing a neutral density filter will do is it will increase your exposure time. So say from 1 second to 10 seconds, or depending on what range you're in. In this case, I didn't need one because of the time of day that it was shot, and because of the fact that it's in a gorge, and using the aperture that I used. I'll just bring
so what was the exposure on this?
So the exposure on this one was f11 at 2.5 seconds.
Okay, 2.5 seconds.
Yeah, and it was shot at 34 millimeter. So anything above a quarter of a second will start to give you that silky kind of water look. And it's all a matter of taste.
Does that also depend on how fast the water flows?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all motion, right?
So the slower the stream of water is, the longer the exposure has to be.
If you want that effect, yes. Now, if I was to do that at a 30-second exposure, then you start to lose some details in the water.
Yeah.
Like you can see in where the water's falling off the rock. There's still some decent detail in it where you can see the streams of water coming down. If I was to do that a lot longer, you would start to lose that. So, and then it would become all white.
Absolutely.
It does appear too that of course you have that rock on the intersecting rule of thirds, and without that or the longer exposure, I really don't see this picture working without that soft water there,
Yeah, I mean, that's a matter of taste. Some people don't like this effect, and some people do. Yeah. So, it's one of those things. In this case, in order for me to get what I wanted to in focus or within the depth of field of the aperture that I was using, it dictated the shutter speed, combining that with the polarizer. I happen to like this effect. I don't like it too much. Like anything longer than 3 seconds, I'd start to not like it. But then,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you use a circular polarizer or one of those stuck-on square ones?
I use a circular. Well, I mean, circular polarizer is a term used for the type of polarizer it is. Doesn't necessarily mean it's round, but I do use a round polarizer that is a circular polarizer as opposed to a linear polarizer.
Yeah, okay, so you don't have ones that are like half
Actually, I do, and if you give me just 1 second, I can show you.
I might have to get one of those then. And you haven't used polarizers since ages.
Polarizer is a very important filter to have if you're going to be a landscape photographer.
Yeah, I figured that. Since I didn't do that since until now, but yeah, it might be a good investment. You know.
Okay, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with a round polarizer.
Yeah.
So what I have is, one of the lenses that I have is the Nikkor 14-24.
Yeah, which is very wide.
Yeah,
which
and it
huge curve.
right, and it doesn't have filter rings on it. So
Yes.
therefore I bought the Lee SW150 filter holder.
Yeah.
And they don't make a polarizer for it because I don't know why they don't. They say that it's on that wide of a lens that it creates too many problems. But anyway, so I went out and bought this polarizer here. You can see it's quite large and it's square.
That's cool. Yeah, and so you could use that for. I could use it for my tilt shift lens even.
Yes. So
And how do you attach it to it?
so this goes into I'm not going to put it all together, but this is the filter holder. So you just take this and you just slide it in.
Yeah, I saw one of those already. So that's a linear one.
Yes, this is a linear polarizer just because the company that I bought this from doesn't make them in circular for the autofocus. But I don't use a whole lot of autofocus in landscape photography anyway because I like to be very selective with where I focus.
Yeah, of course. I don't.
Sometimes the focus points aren't where you want them.
So what is the difference exactly? Linear polarizer is more like a gradient.
No, that would be a graduated neutral density filter. That's where there would be a gradient. A linear polarizer basically doesn't allow the autofocus system, the way the beam splitting for the focusing, for it to pick up the contrast. I don't know the exact technical information on it, but a circular polarizer will allow that to happen so that it can focus properly. So a linear polarizer won't allow an autofocus camera to work properly.
So if you do manual, it doesn't really matter which you're using.
Right, exactly.
If my information is correct from my selling camera days, the autofocus and even metering systems of autofocus cameras use straight lines to do their metering and focusing, so the linear polarizer actually interferes with that.
Correct, yeah.
That was my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know all the details. I'd have to go and look it up, but that's basically what I've gathered from it as well.
And Jim, just to touch on this a little bit more, it seemed to, like, outside of the whole focusing idea, you know, what it does for focusing, my understanding of what a circular polarizer versus a linear polarizer is that circular, you also have the ability to choose the amount of polarization that occurs based on how far you actually turn the dial on the polarizer. Is that correct, or am I off base on that?
Well, the same with a linear polarizer. I have to turn that in order to get the polarizing effect. So it works in the same way. I don't know if there is a filter out called the variable neutral density filter that a few companies make. I know I have one. It's made by Stingray, and it's basically two polarizers together, and they counteract each other to create anywhere from, I don't know, I can't remember if it's 1 to 8 stops worth of light filtering.
So Jim, getting back to the silky water just for a minute. When I first got my D700, I went out and shot with my 50 millimeter lens,
Mm-hmm.
And I put a link there in the chat. And 1/30th of a second was about all I could do handheld. I didn't have a tripod, so this shot was 1/30th of a second, and I found the water nice and silky even at just 1/30th. At least, it gave that kind of little bit of that silky effect.
Yeah, when I look at this, I mean, I could almost tell you that it was around that shutter speed just based on that. I wouldn't call it silky because you do have some details in the water. If you take a look at the main waterfall coming down to the right and the left side of it, you can see individual kind of water streams.
Sure.
That are, they're a little bit longer, but they're not. If it was up to a quarter of a second, it would all kind of meld into one.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, and this is where it has to do with taste. Some people don't like that silky effect. Some people like it more to what our eyes see, which, if I remember reading correctly, our eyes would see more closer to somewhere between the 30th and the 60th of a second.
Okay.
So, I mean, I've had people say, "Oh, I don't like that. It's not natural." So I said, well, what is natural? That would be the question.
Sure.
So back to the photograph of the waterfalls. So I just kind of wanted to go back a bit. So in regards to subject, so this subject, I know this area very well. I go there all the time. I have areas that I go and shoot depending on what time of year, what time of day it is. So this is part of getting to know your subject. So if you can find a place that you can go back to frequently and you can really fine-tune your process of composition on the same subject, different seasons, things like that, that's a really good way to really work on a good foundation of skills in that regard.
May I ask one thing, please?
Yes.
Which polarizing filter would you because you use a D3X or D3S?
D3S, yes.
Well then, so we're similar because I have D3S. Which filter do you use as a polarizer? What brand?
Well,
can you recommend?
I mean, right now I bought 2 Hoya filters, the Pro Digital. I don't really like them. They're hard to clean. They scratch very easily. I have an older Nikon filter that I use that's very good. It's a very good filter. The B&W filters.
B&W, well, that's German.
B plus W, whatever. They're good filters. One of the main things is I wouldn't go with cheap filters, especially if you got a D3S. Don't cheap out on your filters.
I have BW.
Yeah.
For my ND filters.
Yeah. So.
Stick with that, Max.
Yeah, you get the multi-coated filters so that you're going to reduce your glaring and your ghosting and things like that. Unless you like it, of course, but most people don't. Yeah, so I mean, based on your subject, it's very important to understand your subject, the dynamic range of the light that's there, understanding how to see that. And this is something that comes over time. It's not going to be tomorrow. You're not going to go out and be able to see it. Although some people are very good at it. But as you get used to it, you start to look at a subject and you can tell yourself right away, oh, it's beyond the dynamic range of what the camera's capable of. What do I have to do? Do I have to come back at a different time of day when the light is a little bit more diffused and that type of thing? Knowing the direction of the light, where the light's going to come in, that can play a big factor, especially with water. Anytime you get bright sunlight coming into a forest and you're trying to shoot water, chances are your water is always going to be blown out in a waterfall situation. So just always be aware of that. The other thing is always look for distractions within your photograph. I find it's very hard because when you're there, you're focused on the main thing. Like in this shot, you'd be focused on the waterfall in the foreground and the stream going up. A lot of times there may be distracting elements that are coming into the side of your image and just kind of poking into the edge, and those things can become distracting, so you can try to eliminate it. One thing I bring with me when I go out into areas like this is bungee cords. So if I have a branch that's sticking out over kind of in the way, I can just put a bungee cord on it, pull it back, attach it to another branch so that it's out of the way. That way when I'm done my shot, I just pull the bungee cord off and the branch is back where it was before. So keep an eye on dead space. So it's, every area within your photograph, you want it to mean something or have a purpose, right? If there's something in there that really doesn't add to the photograph, you may want to consider recomposing in a different way, or you may know that later on you want to crop it into a different format because the 24 by 36 format doesn't fit all scenes. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. And I always work different angles. So with this shot here, if the waterfalls, I will try it from many different angles to find which one that I find is most pleasing. And that could mean going lower and going higher, getting in closer to the waterfalls. In this shot here, I was standing in the water in order to get this perspective. So that's another thing that you want to consider if you're shooting with a tripod is there enough of a flow in the water that is going to cause vibrations through the tripod, which is going to, blur your image a little bit or take away the sharpness. So you really want to keep an eye on those things. And one of the biggest things is try to pre-visualize what your image is going to look like when you get home and how you're going to process it. So as you gain skills in processing, you can look at an image and say, oh yeah, when I get home, I can maybe bring the brightness up there a little bit, or take the brightness down, and those types of things. So pre-visualizing is also a very important aspect of it, because just like back in the old days with the dark rooms and stuff like that, most good photographers knew what they were going to do in the dark room before they took the picture. Any other questions?
Robert.
Hey guys.
Who do we have here? Robin. How are you, Robin?
Okay, can you see my face?
Yes, I can.
Yes, we can. Yes,
Cool.
we can.
I'm not sure what I jumped into. I saw the name of the Hangout, but
Yeah, we're doing, it's just photography, nature photography.
cool.
Just kind of doing a little workshop hangout.
I can't really stay. I just wanted to say hi. Max, I hadn't seen you in a while.
I'm still here. How are you?
Okay, but I don't want to interrupt.
Well, you can listen.
I can't. I wish I could. I don't have time right now. Had a long day. Gotta go. Take care.
Well, yeah. See you around.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
So at this point, I would kind of move over to the technical aspects. And so based on your subject, whether you want to do a selective focus, if you want everything in focus, considering aperture. I don't know what level everybody at is here, whether you understand how aperture affects your focusing and what's in focus and what's out of focus, which would be referred to as your depth of field.
Yeah.
That type of thing. So there's the hyperfocal or hyperfocus, which would be what is in focus in your immediate foreground and how far back your focus goes so that it's relatively or within good focus. That would be your hyperfocal distance. Usually in a case like that,
Jim, I do have a quick question about that.
Sure.
I shoot a lot of portraits, and so
Yes.
I'm generally focusing on the eyeball. And is the depth of field equal coming towards me and behind? In other words, if let's say I've got 3 inches of depth of field, and I focus on the eyeball, is the 1.5 inches behind the eyeball and in front of the eyeball?
No.
Where is the depth?
Well, 3 inches is a good example because you break it up into thirds. So if you focus on the eyeball, you will have 2 inches behind, if that's your depth of field.
Okay.
2 inches behind will be in focus, and 1 inch in front will be in focus.
Okay, good.
So that would be the guideline.
Okay, good.
So you want to basically have your focal point 1/3 into the depth of field range.
Okay, good. Because that's what I didn't know the answer to, so now I do. Okay, good.
Yeah. So when you're in like a nature photography, is you want to understand that. So understand that range. And there's plenty of depth of field calculators out there, but if you understand the thirds range, so focusing 1/3 into your image will give you that.
Or the portion that you want, 1/3 into the portion you want in focus.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Scott just put up a link for a depth of field master, which is actually a good reference for everyone to read. That'll give you a good understanding. Sometimes it can be hard to say it in words, and sometimes they have illustrations and things like that that can really show you. So again, with anytime you're shooting water, of course, you want to consider your shutter speed. Sometimes shutter speed doesn't make a difference if you're shooting a static landscape, and sometimes it does, because in this case here, if there was a wind coming through here and I'm shooting at 2.5 seconds, all the leaves and that would be moving and they would become all blurry, and I don't want that. So that would be another thing where I will go in there at a certain time of day, knowing either later at night or early in the morning before the warm light comes in and creates the air currents. So that's another important thing to consider. When you're going to shoot a scene like this with a lot of very light foliage.
Yeah, those leaves look rather sharp for a slow shutter speed, so I was assuming no wind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's one of those things where you can start to feel it as the sun starts to come in. You can feel the wind start to pick up, or the breeze is coming in. And then at that point, that type of shooting is pretty much gone. I'm going to pop up one more image just to show the depth of, not the depth of field, the rule of thirds. And this is just a macro shot. Let me see here. Does everybody have that up?
Mm-hmm.
So this is just this was actually right beside that stream I was shooting. I kind of finished my shooting and I was just looking around. And so this is something where I say that be aware of your environment, because there's so much around you, and this is part of what makes this whole scene, right? So there's all kinds of photo opportunities, and sometimes we always focus on the bigger things, but there's also the smaller things. So with this image, I use the rule of thirds, not consciously. It's just something that when I frame things up in the camera, I just gravitate towards that. So what I've used is obviously the flower is the focal point, and then the foliage in the background. I used let me see what it is. This is a macro shot, so it's the depth of field is going to be very minimal anyway. But I used a 5.6 aperture on this, so that all I wanted in focus was the flower, and then the foliage in the background would fade off into out of focus.
And then, what focal length is this? Because you have quite a lot of bokeh there.
Yeah, this was shot with a 150 macro.
Okay, 150 macro.
So about how close were you to the flower?
I was pretty close, because that flower was about the size of my baby fingernail, so that was quite small.
Okay.
So I would probably say within 5 to 8 inches.
Yeah, it only works with a macro lens then.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can see in this image where, obviously you're drawn towards the flower, but once you've kind of looked at the flower, the rule of thirds it kind of takes you through the photograph. So we have the more, or not quite so out of focus, even though they are out of focus, but the ones that are surrounding, the leaves that are surrounding the flower, and then as they go out of focus in the background. And just the way I framed it, like I really tried to put those leaves in a very pleasing way in the background so that the photograph flowed well. The other thing that I try to convince people, and I don't know whether you guys are, you can tell me whether you do or not, is to use your camera in manual mode as much as possible.
All the time. Or when
I do all the time.
Yeah. How about everybody else?
I shoot a lot of aperture priority or shutter priority. I do a lot of events.
Yep.
So, I usually don't have a lot of time. Things are happening very fast. And so I shoot a lot in shutter priority if there's a lot of movement. If there's issues with that, I'll put it, like 1/500th or something to freeze the action and shoot like that, or faster, if it's something really fast.
Yeah.
And then for portraits, I'll just put it at f2.8 and shoot wide open.
Right. Yeah, and just keep in mind that this kind of workshop is based on nature landscape photography, so I do shoot sports and things like that once in a while, and I go to either usually aperture priority as well. But for situations like nature landscape photography, is you really want to have an understanding of the metering, why you're having to select certain shutter speeds and apertures, and if you're doing it automatically, you have a tendency to kind of not focus on it.
Sure.
When you shoot in manual mode, you start to get a better understanding of light, because you're consciously looking at how many seconds it is, what your f-stop is, what your aperture is, things like that. As well, if the camera is metering for you, it may not always be the right metering for what you're shooting. So with this flower, I metered off the flower because the flower was the most important thing. If I was to set it on matrix metering in aperture priority, I won't likely get the exposure that I want.
Sure.
Now you can shoot with exposure compensation, but still that for somebody that's not experienced, that kind of messes with the way they understand, because now they may be shooting 1/3 or 2/3 underexposed, and it can kind of complicate things a bit. So by shooting in manual mode, I just believe that you can have a really much better understanding of what you're doing, and you'll benefit from it later on when you start getting into some really difficult light situations. So
now, do you ever bracket your shots when you're shooting in manual? Just click it a couple stops this way and a stop that way, and just shoot it 3 or 4 times, and then worry about later which one was the best?
I don't worry about it till later. What I try to do, and I generally underexpose my images right off the start by 1/3 of a stop, just because I kind of like my images a little bit on the darker side. What I do is I will start at 1/3 underexposed, and then if it's not working, I will bracket to the point where I get the exposure that I want, and then from there I'll start working on my composition. So I'll get the exposure that I want first, and then I'll start working on the composition. So that's how I kind of break it down into the different elements, being subject, light, and composition. So if you break your process down like that, then what you're doing is you start to understand everything all at once. Like you're not trying to think of everything all at once. You break it down separately. I look at that as eliminating the variables. If you try to do 3 things at once, you're gonna have a hard time.
So when you were shooting that water, for example, you knew kind of how long you wanted your exposure because you knew the silky effect that you wanted, and
Right.
then you can kind of play around with the f-stop. If you're all the way up at f11, I mean, you can bump it one way or the other or whatever, and it's not going to matter that much to your depth of field. So you can use that to get the exposure that you want.
Yeah,
Correct.
and what I'll do in a situation like that is, once I I know I have a pretty good idea of what aperture I need to get what I want in focus. So that's where I start at with my aperture. And then I will start adjusting the shutter speed to where I want to go in order to get it properly exposed. And in a situation like this with the water, I know I go there at the right time of day knowing that I'm going to get that effect with the water.
Gotcha.
If I was to show up there in midday with the sun beating down in there, that would be a different story. I wouldn't even attempt to shoot that midday unless it was overcast. So I guess at this point, I just kind of want to maybe open it up, and anybody has any questions, or what I'm going to do is I just want to put some images on the screen through screen sharing, and I'll use, I guess I'll go to my Ontario catalog if I.
Actually, quickly, Jim, do you mind telling me where is that?
Whereabouts are you located?
I'm East End, Pape and Cosburn.
Was that Coburg?
In Toronto.
Oh, okay. Do you know where Dundas is? Dundas, Ontario?
Yep.
Okay, that's in a place called Spencer Gorge.
Okay.
So
that's near Webster's Falls then?
Yes, that's
okay.
Actually exactly where it is. There's Webster's Falls that flows into Spencer Gorge.
Okay. I haven't been out there in years. I've got to go check it out again.
Yeah, it's for where it is. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah.
It's right in the Hamilton area, and you can walk in there depending on the time of day that you go in there. Obviously, midday tends to be a lot of people.
Yeah.
I go first thing in the morning. I'll go in there at 5 in the morning, and people don't start coming in until 9 o'clock.
Okay.
And then in the midsummer, you go in there around 6 p.m. and I'll stay there till 9 o'clock, and pretty much everybody's gone.
Okay. Like I said, I haven't been there since the film days, so it's been a while.
Yeah. So I'm just going to pop up a screen.
So Paul, now that he told us where it is, he has to kill all of us.
Actually,
you guys outside of the GTA probably don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Actually, I'm doing a workshop there possibly next weekend, depending on how the colors come. So that'll depend. We're probably at about 5% color change around here right now.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm noticing the same thing. Some trees are actually dead already, but other ones are still full of green.
Yeah. So I'm just going to pop up a few images here, and just to kind of show you my style of photography, and kind of how I work and things like that. So this is a shot on Bruce Peninsula up on the Georgian Bay. This image here was actually one that I didn't think was going to turn out very well. I never really. What I normally do when I get home from a trip is I know the images that, even before I get home, the ones that I'm going to start processing first. And I'll usually pick 5 images that I feel are my top images and process them initially. And then I kind of let things sit for a few days, and then I go back and start looking at images. And this is one that I was kind of iffy about. I wasn't really sure. But just so you know that this is an exposure blend, so there's 4 separate exposures put into one.
Jim, you don't have a full screen mode on this, do you? Where you can make the picture a little bigger? If you don't worry about it. But
I don't know how it comes through for you guys as far as.
Don't you have the photos on your computer directly?
You would have to, depending on your screen size, you would have to make this bigger in order for you to get it bigger, because this is a full-size image, like full resolution, that you're looking at.
But can you not open this in Lightroom directly?
It is open directly in Lightroom. Let me hold on a second here. Just switch over to my other one. I see what you're saying about now. There we go.
Remember I showed you my photo that was full screen also? And,
Yeah.
That's perfect.
yeah, that's bigger.
Is that better?
That's bigger. Yep.
So this is a 4-image exposure blend. So what I've done is I've exposed for different exposure values in the image for highlights, shadows, and then midtones. and then put them together through, I can't remember whether I did this one in Photomatix or Photoshop. But you know, with this image, when I initially shot it, I had a vision of to what I wanted it to look like, and I wanted it to be kind of a dark image. The big rock had to be the main focus, and that what I have done some local editing on it to give it a little bit more contrast and help it to give it a really strong kind of a dark look.
So you're calling this exposure blend. What's the difference between calling it that and HDR?
Well, I don't call it HDR because I try not to go for that, what everybody sees as the HDR look with the haloing and things like that. I try to get a more natural look to it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just don't use the HDR term because it has kind of a connotation that people associate with it.
Sure, sure. So can I do this in aperture? Do you know?
I don't use aperture. I do have it on my computer, but I don't use it, so I'm not really 100% sure whether aperture. You may be able to get plugins in order to do exposure blending. I know in Lightroom you can get plugins for doing layers and things like that. What I do is I open this up either in Photomatix, or I bring it into Lightroom as the Photoshop HDR Pro, and then do it through layers.
What about Photoshop Elements? Can I do it in that?
Again, that I'm not sure. I know that the latest Elements is supposed to be pretty good, but I don't have it, so I couldn't tell you for sure.
Okay.
Hey Craig, I just put up a link for the aperture extension you need for HDR stuff.
Okay.
So this next image, again, this is on the Bruce Peninsula, which I have to say is an absolutely beautiful place in Ontario. You can see in this image where I've used the rule of thirds in regards to the big rock or boulder, if you want to call it, down in the bay. And just to give you a reference for size, the cliff that's along the right side, that's about an 80-foot cliff. So if you compare it to the size of that boulder down there, that's a pretty darn big boulder. But just by throwing that boulder in that part of the composition in that lower third there, because it creates a visual interest down there, and then it combine that with the leading lines of the cliff that takes you out into the horizon there with the sky. Just for me anyway, and you guys can talk about it if you want as well. What kind of a feeling do you get when you look at an image like this? Like, do you feel that it's effective?
Oh, it's striking.
You know, Jim, sorry, I was just going to say that the one thing, I mean, I really like this image. The one thing that I wish that was more evident in this was something to give it scale. It's just tough to. I mean, it's a great image in itself, but if you could somehow see, well, geez, that's an 80-foot cliff or whatever.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, because when I look at it, to me it doesn't look like an 80-foot cliff, even though I know it is.
But the trees give it some scale, because you know those trees up there aren't tiny.
Right. I mean, they're not big trees because along that it's pretty harsh weather there, so they are stunted in their growth. There's very little. There's not a lot of soil for them to grow, so they are a stunted kind of a tree. But yeah, I mean, the trees definitely do help give it scale. I think what kind of messes up the scale is that big boulder in the foreground, in the bottom left, because you don't understand how big that is.
Yeah, if somebody was standing on it, then you would.
Yeah, exactly. Or if somebody was standing up at the top of the cliff, you would be able to give it a better reference for scale.
Yeah, but that big boulder, it's part of what makes it cool too, just because of the colors that are in the water there, you know.
Yeah, the part that's submerged.
Yeah, and I mean, that water, this was taken, the sun was behind, just kind of going behind the clouds behind me, shining on the sky and just kind of hitting the cliff there. So this water here, for anybody that's been into the Bruce Peninsula, is very, very clear. And it has that aqua, kind of a turquoise color to it. It's very beautiful. And I will, just to give you an idea of the color.
Was that taken with your 14 to 24?
No, that one was actually taken with the 16 to 35.
Okay. That's that new f.4 lens? F4?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I can't remember why. I think I used that one because I wanted to polarize the water. But when I got home, actually, I noticed, because I did do an exposure with the 14 to 24, and I didn't really need a polarizer on at that point because the sun was in behind the clouds, so there wasn't a whole lot of reflection on the water. But this shot here, this gives you an idea of the color of the water, and even the yellow in the rock, like that's all natural. That's, I didn't oversaturate the colors in the water here. It's very close to what it is.
I've forgotten how beautiful it is up there.
Oh, it is. Every time I go back there, I always say, why don't I come up here more often? Because it's just...
Again, for me, it was the film days.
Yeah.
So 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So you have both the 14 to 24 and the 16 to 35. If you were just going to buy one lens, one wide angle zoom, which would you buy of those two?
Well, me, I would buy the 14 to 24.
Okay.
But the thing that you gotta understand, though, is that the 14 to 24, it's a lot more expensive. And to buy, in order to get set up for filters on it, you're getting up close to, depending on where you live, to get a full set of filters, you're looking at about $1,000. So that may steer some people away from the 14 to 24.
One thing I'd like to point out with that, in regard to that too, is remember that unless you're using a full frame camera, the 14 to 24 is probably not your best option.
I am using full frame.
Right.
Yeah.
Just for others that may not be, keep that in mind, is that you're going to have a 1.5 times crop factor on that, so you're really not getting 14, you're getting 14 times 1.5.
Yeah. But yeah, and I agree that for the value or for the cost of the lens, it may not be the most effective way. But I can say one thing though is, as well as shooting on a D3X, I use it on a D300. And when I first used that lens, I was blown away by the clarity and the resolution that lens was able to resolve. It's an amazingly sharp lens for a zoom lens. And it has a reputation. That's why a lot of Canon users have started using it with an adapter, because it is that good.
And you think considerably sharper than the 16 to 35?
If you're going to be shooting and just posting on the web, I would say it's not worth the extra. But if you're going to be doing enlargements, 30 by 40 and larger, then yes, I would say that you're going to notice a slight difference. I wouldn't say it's going to, because the 16 to 35 is a pretty sharp lens.
Okay.
If money was a consideration, I would definitely recommend the 16 to 35, just because it's a cheaper lens and you can buy a set of filters for it for a lot cheaper than the 14 to 24. The other thing, one of the disadvantages, and this is why I still keep the 16 to 35, is the 14 to 24 is known for, it's very susceptible to glare. So if you're shooting into the sun, or if the sun's coming in from the side and it hits the element, it is known for flare and glare off the elements. So that's where I will, if I'm in that situation, I'll put up an image. I don't have an image with the ghosting or the flaring on it, because I try to avoid it. But this scene here that I put up, I originally had the 14 to 24 on, and I took it off because I was getting flare on the lens. So I put the 16 to 35 on, and that pretty much eliminated the flaring.
That looks daggone good.
This is in. It's funny because the one guy that was on earlier, Daryl Van Gaal, he lives out in this area, and I've known this area since I was a teenager. It's called Waterford Ponds, and you come out here to swim and do whatever, fish. But we walked out here, and as soon as I turned and looked at this scene, I saw the picture that I wanted, like right away. And this is where pre-visualization comes in. Is very important. Is when you can see that image right away. You know that you're kind of getting into the zone, and that's where I think with composition that understanding the rule of thirds and using it until it's ingrained into your eyes or your brain. And as soon as I looked at it, I said to Daryl, I said, no, this is how I would frame it. Is we have the rock and the reeds in the foreground, which create a really nice interest in the foreground, and the way the shoreline kind of comes and curves around with the willows, and then comes out to where the sun is going to set. To me, I mean, right away I thought, wow, this is going to be a nice shot. And
so how long did you have to wait for the light to be just right?
I've probably been to this place about 8 times so far this year to try and get the right light, and this was the only time that I was successful in getting what I wanted.
Was this an exposure blend, Jim?
Yes, it was. So based on the fact that it was a very relatively bright sky, you can see that the sun was just kind of dipping into the clouds, but it was still relatively bright. The foreground here with the rocks and the reeds was fairly dark, but I wanted those to show up. The color and the detail. I didn't want it to be a silhouette. So therefore I had to expose for the foreground, expose for the willow trees up in the top right-hand portion, and then again expose for the sky so that I didn't have a blown-out sky and still retain the colors.
Now, I've heard people say that the human eye can handle like 11 stops of light, and the best camera is only about 6. Is that an accurate rule of thumb, or?
Well, I read conflicting things on that, and I've heard that the human eye can see about 20 stops, and a camera is around half of that. So, but I think the thing that I would take out of it is that our eyes have about double the dynamic range of a camera.
So when do we think it will be that the cameras will catch up? How many years from now will the cameras just be able to assume that you have the same range that your eye has?
I think they're doing really well. And because you brought that up, I'm going to throw another image up, which this one is a single exposure. And I did, when I took this scene, I did do exposure bracketing on it because I didn't think that the camera would be able to handle the range of light. But this image is a single exposure. I exposed for the highlights in the sky so that they weren't blown out. And I was able to, instead of blending 2 or 3, maybe sometimes 4 images, I was able to bring out the shadows in this one in the foreground of the rock suitable enough that there wasn't any noise that was created in there. So that's a good example of how far, and this was shot with a D3X, is to, how much dynamic range that cameras are getting to the point of being able to capture. And keep in mind that the D3X is not known for having a wide dynamic range because of the pixel density. If you compare it to the D3S, which has a higher dynamic range than the D3X does.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it seems like some of these newer cameras, like the Sonys that just came out, 24 megapixels, they're starting to get pretty good ISO performance. It seems like they're starting to get better all the time to where you can almost have your cake and eat it too. You can have a bunch of megapixels and still have a lot of range. I wonder what the D4 will end up being.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, Nikon has Sony make their sensors for them, I don't think that Sony does as good of a job in the the kind of behind the scenes processing that the camera does, whereas I believe that Nikon has a much better their algorithms or whatever you want to call it as far as the processing goes after the image has been captured. So I think that once Nikon comes out with their latest camera, that it's going to leapfrog. I haven't even shot with a Sony just based on what I've read on it. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, because the Sony's a relatively inexpensive camera.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the things. Like, Paul, you would know in the film days, if you wanted to shoot a scene that had a high dynamic range, graduated neutral density filters were almost a must back in those days.
You had to. I rarely did, but yeah, you had to, because with slide film, it was what? If the digital cameras today are, 10 stops, whereas the IS-20 slide film was 4?
Yeah.
5 stops. So, I've actually started recently scanning some slides, and I've got a shot of the Gannet I shot in Gaspé in Quebec. And the Gannet, basically the top of the wing is completely white. There's absolutely no detail in that wing at all, and the cliffs behind it are completely black.
Right.
I couldn't bring either one of them out.
Yes.
So slide film had absolutely very, very little dynamic range at all.
Right.
And you didn't have the option of multiple shots to blend them together either.
Right. And that's what I've been doing lately is I don't use my graduated neutral density filters as much as I used to, because I don't have to now. Even though I still do use them. Certain situations, I gotta show you this one, because I want to show how neutral density filters can sometimes get in the way of taking a photograph, even though you may not see it really evident. I don't know how well you'll see it through the screen sharing. But this shot, I used a neutral density filter on it. This was taken in 2008 with my D300, and I used the neutral density filter to knock the exposure down in the sky, so it was a 2-stop graduated filter. But if you look in the cactus, the saguaro cactus,
Bottom, but not at the top.
right, so at the bottom of the saguaro cactus, you can see, pretty good detail in the green. As you get towards the top, the exposure on that has been knocked down, right? So it doesn't look even. So I did try and lighten the cactus up as much as I could, but it was starting to introduce too much noise, so I just left it as it is.
So was this a single exposure?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is a single exposure using a 2-stop graduated neutral density filter. So in a situation like this, where you have a tree or, say, a mountain that's going up into a bright sky, a neutral density filter is going to make it more difficult for you to get the exposure you want. So if I was to shoot this scene again, I would do a multiple exposure blend on it, so that way the cactus would be evenly exposed of its entire length.
But it's interesting to me, looking at this photo, the photo doesn't seem to have depth to it. Maybe that's because the top of the cactus is so dark. It seems pretty flat.
Yes. Part of it is the scene. The scene, we have the jumping cactus in the foreground, which are kind of surrounding the saguaro cactus. There is the desert that goes off, but it's very flat and almost featureless at this size. Like when I have this one actually blown up quite large, and you can see the details of the other cactus in there, but we have a fairly flat horizon, and then we just have the sky, so there's not a lot of depth between where the saguaro is and then where the mountains in the background are.
Not a lot of perceived depth.
Right.
Yeah.
Although you can tell, those mountains are quite a distance off in the background. But yeah, it does give the image has a flatter look to it. But yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to. I don't want to bore you guys with too many more images, but I just wanted to show examples so that that everybody can kind of have an understanding of the different methods with different types of filters, and how sometimes filters aren't appropriate, sometimes they are, and then how to use them to your advantage.
So, Jim, I'm going to stop the recording. Do you want to give a website address that folks can go to for more information?
I do have a workshop website, but right offhand I'd have to. I don't even know if I could find it quick enough for you.
Let's do a round robin while you're checking that and see. Scott, is there anything that you wanted to mention? Any website or anything?
No, I can't really.
Okay.
Nothing really comes to mind. The only thing that I thought of was the depth of field master, that link that I put up there. And while it there's several of them out there, it's a good way to kind of visually see what your depth of field is going to be doing.
And that's dofmaster.com. dofmaster.com.
Correct.
Yeah. And Paul, anything that you wanted to share?
No, I'm good. This was great. Reminded me of some places that I haven't been for a very long time and need to go back.
Cool. Max?
I think I'm too tired to think now. But
yeah, it's the middle of the night in Germany.
It's 4:15 a.m.
Early morning. Time to get up.
Yeah, it's almost breakfast time.
I might as well stay up.
It's almost like I can see sunlight coming in from your left there. Is that the sun?
That's not sunlight. That's my land. You know that.
Okay. Jim, did you happen to find that web address? You're muted now.
I don't have it handy right here.
Okay.
Address that I have for a blog, but for some reason I don't have it on my menu bar. It must have gotten deleted. But what I will do is give you the address for my gallery, and what I will do is when I find it, I will put the link in there for the workshops. But so it's www.jimmy-d.smugmug.com.
Yeah, I see that. Jimmy, JIMMY-D.smugmug.com. Yep.
Yes.
Very good.
I'll always share the recording, so I'll put that those links in there.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.